2-4. Like I said, one of my very favorites. We are doing law of detachment and law of syllogism today. And these are things that you will use often in life. It's just being reasonable, logical thinkers, okay? So for the law of detachment, like I said, reasonable, logical thinkers. You're just reasoning logically from some statement or statements that are given to you to come up with, okay, well then what's the conclusion here? What am I supposed to be? Oh, everything is slow. I'll get the PDF in a minute. Don't let me forget to do that. So the law of detachment says this. If your conditional is true, okay, and the hypothesis of that conditional is true, then we conclude that the conclusion will be true, okay? A shorthand way of saying that is if P then Q is true, okay, and then the P portion of that is true, your conclusion will be that the Q portion is true, okay? So it's like saying this. If a student gets an A on a final exam, then the student will pass the course, okay? So now granted, this would have to be true for the course, right? But let's say you have 100 points in a class and your final exam is worth 60 of those 100. Well, if you pass the final, that's not true. If you get an A on the final, you have at least a 60 in the class already, right? So assuming this is true, okay, if a student gets an A on a final exam, then the student will pass the course, okay? If P, then Q. The next statement they say is Susie got an A on her final exam. Is that your P or Q portion of the previous statement? P, it's the hypothesis, getting an A on the final, right? So now they're saying P is true, right? So they first gave us this statement, that was true. Then they say, okay, well the P part is true, so you conclude what? Susie passed her course, right? If a student gets an A on the final exam, then the student will pass the course. Susie got an A on her history final, so we would say Susie passed her history class. Does that make sense? So if P then Q, they tell you the P part is true, so then you can say Q is true also, okay? That doesn't work in all situations if they flip-flop things a little bit. Let me show you what I mean by that. This one says, if you have a license, then you can legally drive a car. If you have a license, then you can legally drive a car. That's a true statement, okay? But then the next statement says, you drove to the store. What do you conclude?
You can drive.
You conclude you can drive because you did drive. Can you make a conclusion about this? No, because it says if you have a license, then you can drive to the store. And all it says is you drove to the store. Here's the example I will give you. My mother, at 14 years old, her dad was a smoker. And back in her day, it was like they would let anyone buy cigarettes. So her dad would be like, hey, Vicky, here's the keys. Go drive to the store and get me a pack of cigarettes. And she would literally drive to the store downtown. I mean, granted, there's like no stoplights, teeny little town, whatever, but still not legal. And she would drive to the store and buy her father a pack of cigarettes. That does not mean she had a license, right? That was illegal. So just keep in mind, it's got to be if P, then Q, and they tell you P is true. If they tell you Q is true, right, this is the conclusion. You drove to the store. You have to say, it is not possible to make a conclusion here because she could have driven illegally, right? God bless you. Does that make sense? So you're always looking for if P then Q, P is true, so you say Q is true, right? That's this thing up here that we just wrote down. So that's called the law of detachment, okay? I feel like it's easy to do that one wrong if you're not paying attention to hypothesis versus conclusion, right? Pay attention to what they're giving you. Are they giving you that if part or are they giving you the then part, okay? Law of syllogism is a little bit different, and you will do this your junior year in English class. They're talking about this like last week in English class. So remember this if you are freshman or sophomore for your junior year, and you will be so wise for your English teacher. Law of syllogism says this: if you have a statement, if P then Q, and then another statement, if Q then R, what happens is you take out the thing in the middle and you say if P then R. Okay? It has to be that if then format though. So let's just show you with this. This first one says, if a figure is a square, then the figure is a rectangle. The one after that says, if a figure is a rectangle, then the figure has 4 sides. Does anyone see the conclusion? What would you say? Go ahead, Emily.
Is it if the figure is a square, then the figure has 4 sides?
Yes. So this is if P then Q, and if Q then R. We take out the 2 that are the same, right? So you're looking for things that are the same, and you're taking them out. But here's where you have to be careful. If you take those out, and what you're left with is not an if-then statement anymore, you have to say not possible, okay? This one is an if-then. This one says if a figure is a square, then the figure has 4 sides. Okay. But look at this next one. This one says, if you do gymnastics, then you are flexible. If you do ballet, then you are flexible. What's the same about them? You are flexible. Those are both the, like, if P then Q, right? That's both the Q. They're both both conclusions. Okay, so if I take them away, the 2 that are the same, it says, if you do gymnastics, if you do ballet. Does that make sense? No. So you're going to conclude this is not possible to make a conclusion. There's no statement. There's no tie-in there, right? If you do gymnastics, you're flexible. If you do ballet, you're flexible. You can't just say, if you do gymnastics, if you do ballet. It has to be an if-then statement that makes sense with what we're talking about, okay? Okay, this third one seems a little different. It's actually the exact same thing, and I think you can come up with an answer. So let's talk through this, and then you're going to tell your neighbor what conclusion you would make, okay? It says, if a whole number is divisible by 10, then it is divisible by 5. If a whole number ends in 0, then it's divisible by 10. Take a look at that, and then tell your neighbor what conclusion you would make. It's a little bit different. right. What'd you say? If a whole number ends in 0, then it's divisible by 5. Is that what you got? Yeah? So here's the deal. Divisible by 10, divisible by 10, right? You're left with an if-then statement. Don't say if a number is divisible by 5, then it ends in 0, right? That's not what we were left with. So it doesn't have to be in the right order. You need to put it in the right order. If you have that hypothesis, if a whole number ends in 0, then it is divisible by 5. Okay? Good on that? Okay. What if you're left with two then statements? Not possible. Okay, so two if statements, not possible. Two then statements, not possible. If then statement, when you've taken out the two that are the same, fully possible. Okay? Okay, so now we combine one big problem, syllogism and detachment together. This one says if you live in Cerritos, then you live in California. If you live in California, then you live in the US, and James lives in Cerritos. Written. Yeah.
So I crossed out the 2 Californias.
Okay. I like that.
And then my conclusion is that James lives in Cerritos and also in the US. But I don't have to work.
Okay. So here's the thing. What you did here, you crossed out the 2 Californias. Which law is that? Is that detachment or syllogism? That's syllogism, right? Where the two that are the same go away. So now look at what you're left with. If you live in Cerritos, then you live in the US, okay? And James lives in Cerritos. Okay, so this is your new statement now, because we got rid of the if-then of the other one, right? Law of syllogism. Law of detachment says, what's your conclusion here? James what? Lives in the US, right? So you don't have to restate that he lives in Cerritos because they told us he lives in Cerritos, right? So if you live in Cerritos, then you live in the US. James lives in Cerritos. So if P, then Q. They gave us the P portion back, so we can say Q is true. So be specific. We're talking about James here. James lives in the US. Okay, so if you put syllogism and detachment together, you want to do syllogism first, because that's going to get rid of some things, and then we have this new statement that we can work with. Isn't that so fun? I love this stuff. I love law of syllogism, law of detachment.